The gunshot didn't echo the way people imagined it would. It cracked once, sharp, final, and then the street swallowed the sound like it had swallowed so many screams before it. Bumpy Johnson stood frozen in the half-light of a Harlem morning, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air, one trigger pull, one life collapsing onto cold pavement. And for the first time in decades, the man who ruled Harlem's underworld felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't a shootout with rivals. This wasn't business. This wasn't war. This was personal, and it was wrong. The body lay just steps from the curb, eyes staring at nothing, blood crawling toward the gutter like it knew where it belonged. Around them, Harlem paused. Windows cracked open. A curtain moved. Somewhere, a woman whispered a prayer she didn't know she still believed in. Bumpy didn't run. He never ran. Instead, he looked down at the fallen man, jaw tightening, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest harder than any prison sentence ever had. He had seen death before, ordered it, sanctioned it, lived alongside it. But this death didn't carry the familiar shape of inevitability. This one felt like a fracture in the code he had built his life around. One trigger pull, one legend shaken, and the city would feel the aftershock. Long before that morning, before the blood and the sirens and the questions even the streets were afraid to ask, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had become something larger than flesh and bone. In Harlem, his name didn't need explanation. It moved through barbershops and back rooms, whispered in churches, and spoken carefully in precinct offices south of 125th Street. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a balance. Born in South Carolina and forged in the brutal contradictions of early 20th century New York, Bumpy Johnson rose in a city that offered black men only two choices: submission or defiance. Harlem in those years was alive, jazz spilling from basements, ambition crackling in the air, but it was also watched, policed, exploited. White-owned rackets bled the neighborhood dry while lawmen looked the other way, so long as the right palms stayed greased. Bumpy learned early that respect wasn't given, it was enforced. By the time he took control of Harlem's numbers racket under the uneasy partnership with Dutch Schultz and later the Italian Mafia, he had already written his reputation in scars and silence. He was educated when others weren't expected to be, calm when others raged, ruthless when the situation demanded it, and only then. There were rules under Bumpy Johnson. Women weren't touched. Children were off limits. Harlem came first. Those who followed him knew this. Those who challenged him learned it quickly. And the police? They learned to tread carefully. Bumpy wasn't immune to the law. No one like him ever was, but he understood power better than most men in uniform. Arrests came and went. Prison doors closed and reopened. Each time he returned to Harlem, his presence felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the streets themselves adjusted their posture when he walked them. Which was why that body on the pavement felt so different. The man lying there wasn't a rival boss or an ambitious lieutenant. He wasn't a traitor exposed or an enemy eliminated. He was a young runner, barely more than a boy by the standards of the game, someone who had panicked, made a mistake, and paid a price far steeper than Bumpy had ever authorized. That was the problem. By the time the first patrol car rolled in, its tires hissing against the curb, Bumpy Johnson had already understood what this meant, not just for him, but for Harlem. Because violence, once loosed without purpose, invited attention, and attention invited consequences. The officer who stepped out of the car recognized him immediately. Everyone did. His hand hovered near his holster, not out of courage, but habit. The street was quiet now, too quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes judgment. "Mr. Johnson," the officer said carefully, eyes flicking from the body to Bumpy's face. "You mind telling me what happened here?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. He looked down the block instead, at the brownstones standing shoulder to shoulder like witnesses who had seen too much to be shocked anymore. This neighborhood had survived riots, raids, betrayals, and broken promises from City Hall. It had survived because men like him had enforced order where none was offered. But order had rules, and today one of them had been broken. "I'll tell you this," Bumpy finally said, his voice low, controlled. "That wasn't supposed to happen." The officer swallowed. He'd heard rumors. Everyone had. But hearing restraint from a man known for command unsettled him more than threats ever could. Within minutes, more cars arrived. Then detectives. Then the questions sharpened. Somewhere between the flashing lights and the gathering crowd, Bumpy Johnson realized the truth settling into his bones. This wasn't just an investigation. This was a test of his authority, of his code, of whether Harlem would continue to be ruled by rules or by chaos. And the ones watching most closely weren't the police. They were his own people. Because when a legend loses control, even for a moment, the city doesn't ask if he's still powerful. It asks if he's still necessary. The police tape went up fast. Too fast for a neighborhood used to watching authorities drag their feet. Yellow lines cut across the street like a warning, not just to civilians, but to anyone who understood what territory meant in Harlem. Word traveled quicker than sirens. By the time the coroner's van arrived, the story had already splintered into a dozen versions, each one more dangerous than the last. Bumpy Johnson stayed until he was told, politely but firmly, that he should leave. That alone told him everything. Back in the day, officers avoided ordering him anywhere in public. They asked, they suggested, they negotiated. Today, their posture had shifted, not openly hostile, but alert, curious, testing the waters. That unsettled him more than any show of force. Inside the black sedan waiting at the corner, the air was thick with silence. His driver, Slim Charles, kept his eyes forward, knuckles tight on the wheel. "That kid wasn't supposed to be carrying," Slim said finally, choosing each word like it might explode. "Not that kind of heat." Bumpy nodded once. He already knew. The gun hadn't been sanctioned, the trigger pull hadn't been ordered, and the man who fired it, Little Ray, had acted on fear, not instruction. Fear was unpredictable. Fear was contagious. Fear got legends killed. "Who gave him the gun?" Bumpy asked. Slim hesitated. That hesitation was another fracture. "Eddie Washington," he said. "Said Ray needed protection. Said things were heating up." Bumpy leaned back, eyes closing for half a second. Eddie Washington was old Harlem, too old to make a move like that without thinking it through, which meant either he was slipping or someone had leaned on him. Neither answer was comforting. By nightfall, Harlem buzzed. Storefronts stayed open later than usual. Men gathered on corners, speaking in low tones. The younger ones were restless, excited even. A killing carried weight, but it also carried opportunity. Power vacuums didn't announce themselves. They were felt. And the Italians felt it too. Across town, in a smoke-filled back room that didn't belong to Harlem, men in tailored suits discussed the morning's violence with measured interest. Bumpy Johnson had always been useful, an intermediary, a stabilizer, but usefulness depended on control. If Harlem started bleeding unpredictably, the partnership became a liability. Respect, in their world, was conditional. So was loyalty. The next day, the challenge arrived. Not with a gun, but with a badge. Captain Walter Hennessey had been chasing Bumpy Johnson's shadow for years. Not out of obsession, but ambition. Harlem was a line on his resume, a problem he wanted to be known for solving. And this shooting? This was leverage. They summoned Bumpy to the precinct under the pretense of clearing things up. He knew better. The building smelled like old paper and authority. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he walked past desks where officers pretended not to stare. Some of them remembered him from previous arrests. Some had grown up hearing stories about him. All of them understood one thing. This wasn't a man you humiliated lightly. Captain Hennessey waited in his office, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, playing the part of the working man. He didn't offer a seat. "Ellsworth Johnson," he said, deliberately using the full name. "You know why you're here." Bumpy stood calmly, hands folded behind his back. "You called me," he replied. "So you tell me." Hennessey smiled thinly. "A kid ends up dead in your neighborhood. Witnesses put your people nearby. That makes it your problem." "Harlem's always been my problem," Bumpy said evenly. "You boys just visit when it suits you." The smile vanished. Hennessey leaned forward. "Here's how this is going to work. You give me the shooter. You give me the gun. And maybe, I don't dig any deeper." There it was, the challenge, laid bare. Because digging deeper didn't just mean arrests, it meant raids. It meant pressure. It meant turning the community against the man who had kept worse forces at bay. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. "And if I don't?" he asked. Hennessey's voice hardened. "Then I make an example of you, of Harlem, of anyone who thinks they can run a city without consequences." The room felt smaller then, not because of walls, but because power was being tested. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't posture. He simply said, "You make your move, Captain. Just understand something." Hennessey waited. "When you push too hard," Bumpy continued, "you don't break men like me. You break the peace. And once that's gone, you don't get to decide how it comes back." Silence. The captain exhaled sharply. "You have 48 hours. Outside, the city waited. But the real danger wasn't the police. It was the question spreading through Harlem like a slow-burning fire. Had Bumpy Johnson lost control, or was he about to remind everyone why he had it in the first place? The 48 hours didn't pass quietly. They never did in Harlem. Not when blood had been spilled and the balance was wobbling. The neighborhood moved like a body holding its breath. Music played lower. Dice games broke up early. Even the bravest men watched the corners twice before stepping into the street. Inside a brownstone that had served as both refuge and command post for years, Bumpy Johnson sat at the head of a long table, the room lit by a single overhead fixture. Around him were men who had survived raids, wars, and betrayals. Each one waited, not for orders, but for direction. Because this wasn't a problem bullets could solve. Little Ray had vanished the night of the shooting. That much was certain. Whether he'd run on instinct or been pushed underground by someone hoping to use him as currency was still unclear. Either way, his disappearance was a liability. The police wanted him, the Italians wanted assurances, and the streets wanted blood or answers, preferably both. Bumpy wanted order. "Anybody hears Ray's name," Bumpy said calmly, "you don't move, you don't promise, you don't scare him further into a hole." One of the men shifted. "Captain Hennessey ain't bluffing," he said. "They're already lining up warrants." Bumpy nodded. "That's his job. What's ours?" Bumpy's eyes lifted slowly, settling on each face in turn. "To make sure Harlem doesn't pay for one man's mistake." That was the difference between a boss and a legend. A boss protected himself. A legend absorbed the damage. Still, even legends had limits. That night, word came from an unexpected direction. Eddie Washington had been seen uptown drinking too much, talking too loud. Guilt did that to men. It loosened their tongues. By the time Bumpy sent someone to bring him in, Eddie was already sweating through his shirt. "I didn't mean for none of this," Eddie said, pacing the room. "The kid was scared. Folks been talking. Italians been pressing. I figured—" "You figured wrong," Bumpy cut in, his voice sharp but controlled. Eddie stopped pacing. "I thought giving him a piece would keep him safe." Bumpy leaned forward. "A gun don't keep a scared man safe. It gives him a way to panic faster." Silence settled heavy between them. "You broke the rules," Bumpy continued. You know what that means? Eddie nodded, eyes downcast. He had lived long enough under Bumpy's structure to understand consequences. But this time, the consequences were bigger than him. There's more, Eddie said quietly. Captain Hennessey's been talking to the papers, framing this like a gang execution. That was the real threat. Once the narrative escaped Harlem, it became a weapon. Headlines didn't care about codes or context. They cared about fear, and fear justified force. Bumpy stood, straightening his coat. Get me Ray. They found little Ray just before dawn, holed up in a tenement on the edge of the neighborhood. He looked smaller than his reputation suggested, hands shaking, eyes red from sleeplessness. I didn't mean to pull it, Ray said the moment Bumpy entered the room. He rushed me. I thought... I know, Bumpy said. That answer surprised everyone. Ray looked up. You do? Bumpy nodded. I know what fear feels like. I also know what it costs. Ray swallowed hard. They're gonna kill me. Not if I handle this, Bumpy replied. But understand something. This ain't about saving you. It's about fixing what you broke. Ray nodded frantically. I'll do whatever you say. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would ripple far beyond that room. You're turning yourself in. The words landed like a slap. Ray's face drained of color. You said... I said I'd handle it, Bumpy interrupted. This is how. There were murmurs behind him. Turning over one of their own wasn't just rare. It was dangerous. It set a precedent. It showed weakness, some would say. Bumpy didn't flinch. This ends the police pressure, he continued. It tells Harlem the rules still matter. And it tells the Italians I don't lose control of my house. And if the captain don't play fair? Someone asked. Bumpy's eyes hardened. Then we'll have a different conversation. When little Ray walked into the precinct later that morning, escorted not by police but by Bumpy Johnson himself, the building froze. Officers stared. Detectives whispered. Captain Hennessey stepped out of his office, disbelief flashing across his face before he masked it with triumph. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Didn't think you had it in you. Bumpy said nothing. Hennessey glanced at Ray. Cuff him. As officers moved in, Hennessey leaned closer to Bumpy. You did the right thing. Shows you know when your time's up. That was the moment. Not the gunshot. Not the arrest. This. Because disrespect, once spoken, demanded an answer. Bumpy turned slowly, meeting Hennessey's gaze. The room quieted instinctively. My time, Bumpy said evenly, ain't something you get to measure. Hennessey smirked. We'll see. The doors closed behind Ray, and with them, the illusion that this was over, because Bumpy Johnson hadn't just surrendered a man. He had placed himself directly in the crosshairs of authority, and the real confrontation was still coming. Captain Hennessey didn't wait long. Power never does when it thinks it has momentum. Within hours of Little Ray's surrender, Harlem felt the shift. Squad cars lined avenues where they rarely lingered. Plainclothes officers leaned too long against lampposts. Warrants were executed with enthusiasm, not necessity. Doors were knocked on hard enough to send messages through brick walls. This wasn't policing. This was pressure. And everyone knew exactly who it was meant for. Bumpy Johnson watched it unfold from the window of his brownstone, hands folded behind his back, face unreadable. He had given Hennessey what he asked for. He had shown restraint. He had upheld the code. And still, the captain pushed. That told Bumpy everything he needed to know. This wasn't about justice for a dead man. This was about domination. By late afternoon, the call came from downtown. Not a summons this time, an order. Captain Hennessey wanted Bumpy at City Hall. Special hearing, joint task force, press quietly waiting in the wings. They weren't hiding the stage anymore. They're trying to box you in, Slim said. Make you look small. Bumpy adjusted his tie. Men only look small when they act small. City Hall carried its own kind of menace. Polished floors, echoing corridors, the illusion of neutrality. Inside a closed conference room sat men who believed power came from titles and signatures. Police brass, city officials, a prosecutor with a pencil already poised like a dagger. Hennessey stood when Bumpy entered. "Mr. Johnson," he said loudly, ensuring everyone heard. "Take a seat." Bumpy didn't. "I'll stand," he replied. A murmur rippled through the room. Hennessey's jaw tightened. "Suit yourself. Let's get to it. Since this morning, we've connected your organization to 3 illegal operations, multiple parole violations, and now a confirmed homicide." Bumpy's eyes moved slowly, taking in the room. No anger, no surprise. "You connected or you accused?" Bumpy asked. The prosecutor spoke up. "This isn't a street corner, Mr. Johnson. This is an official proceeding." Bumpy turned to him. "Then speak official. Accusations without proof don't hold up anywhere, not even here." Hennessey slammed his palm on the table. "Enough. You think turning in one trigger man buys you immunity?" "I think it buys you honesty," Bumpy said calmly. "Something you don't seem interested in." That landed. Hennessey stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're finished. Harlem's tired of you. The city's tired of you. This," he gestured broadly, "is the beginning of the end." The room held its breath. Bumpy finally leaned forward, hands resting on the table. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried. "You ever been to Harlem at night, Captain? Not riding through? Walking? Listening?" Hennessey scoffed. "I don't take strolls through criminal neighborhoods." "That's the difference," Bumpy said. "You see criminals, I see people. And those people know who keeps the wolves out." One of the officials shifted uncomfortably. "You flood my streets with uniforms," Bumpy continued, "and all you do is remind folks who never protected them. You take me out without replacing the order I built, and chaos don't ask permission before it moves in." The prosecutor frowned. "Is that a threat?" Bumpy met his eyes. "It's a warning." Silence followed, thick, heavy, undeniable. Hennessey straightened. "You're not untouchable." Bumpy nodded once. "Never said I was." He reached into his coat and removed a folded document, sliding it across the table. Hennessey glanced down, then froze. "What is this?" he asked. "Affidavits," Bumpy replied, "from business owners, pastors, community leaders, all testifying to harassment, illegal searches, and coerced statements by your task force." The prosecutor snatched the papers, scanning quickly. His expression darkened. "You think this scares me?" Hennessey snapped. Bumpy leaned back. "No, but it scares your bosses and the papers." As if on cue, raised voices echoed faintly from outside the room, reporters catching a scent, cameras clicking in the distance. One of the city officials cleared his throat. "Captain, perhaps we should—" Hennessey cut him off. "No, this ends now." He turned back to Bumpy. "You want to play politician? Fine. But understand this. You step out of line once more, and I bury you under procedure." Bumpy stood straight, towering in his quiet way. "Captain," he said, "you already stepped out of line. You just mistook silence for permission." He turned and walked toward the door. "Meeting's over," he added without looking back. No one stopped him. They couldn't. Outside, cameras flashed as Bumpy emerged. Reporters shouted questions. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The message had already traveled. By nightfall, the pressure eased. Squad cars thinned. Raids stalled. Orders were quietly walked back. City Hall denied everything. The captain went silent. Harlem noticed. So did the Italians. That evening, a message arrived through familiar channels. Acknowledgement. Respect. The balance restored, for now. But Bumpy Johnson knew better than to mistake a retreat for surrender. Back on his block, neighbors watched him pass with something close to relief in their eyes. Not admiration, not fear, stability. He paused at the stoop, looking out over the street that had tested him. One trigger pull had threatened everything. But restraint, measured, deliberate restraint, had reminded the city why legends endured when others fell. Still, the cost lingered. A young man sat in a cell, a family mourned, and authority had shown its hand. The lesson was clear. Power didn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it waited, quietly, until the moment demanded an answer. The city exhaled slowly, like a man who had held his breath too long. Harlem didn't celebrate. It recalibrated. The patrol cars faded back into motion instead of menace. The plainclothes officers stopped lingering. Doors that had been kicked in were quietly repaired. Life resumed, not because danger was gone, but because balance had been restored. And balance, in Harlem, had a name. Inside the precinct, Captain Hennessey sat alone in his office, jacket still hanging on the back of his chair. The affidavits had moved faster than he expected, up the chain, across desks, into hands that cared less about ego and more about headlines. No formal reprimand came down. Those were rare, but the message did. His task force was reassigned. His jurisdiction narrowed. His ambitions, once loud, were now spoken of carefully, if at all. Power didn't always fall with a crash. Sometimes it eroded. Little Ray's case moved quickly, too quickly for anyone paying attention. The charge stuck, manslaughter, not murder, no grandstanding, no media circus, a clean conviction wrapped in procedural efficiency. Some called it leniency. Those who understood called it proportion. Bumpy Johnson attended none of the hearings. He didn't need to. Justice, in this instance, wasn't about presence. It was about outcome. The boy would serve time, but he would live. And more importantly, the streets would see that the rules still mattered, even when they hurt. That mattered. In the weeks that followed, Harlem's elders took notice. Pastors spoke openly about order. Shopkeepers nodded when Bumpy passed. Mothers let their children linger a little longer on the stoops in the evening, not because danger was gone, but because it was managed. That was Bumpy's real currency. Not fear, not violence, but predictability. In a city that treated black neighborhoods like afterthoughts, predictability was safety. One afternoon, Bumpy received a visit from a familiar face, an Italian intermediary, impeccably dressed, voice smooth with practiced diplomacy. "You handled it well," the man said over coffee. "Could have gone another way." Bumpy stirred his cup slowly. "Could have gone many ways." The man nodded. "Some thought you might push back harder." Bumpy looked up. "Harder don't always mean smarter." A pause. "There are opportunities," the man continued. "New arrangements, people willing to invest." Bumpy set the cup down. "Harlem ain't an opportunity, it's a responsibility." The man smiled thinly. "That's why we respect you." Respect. The word had been tested and earned again, but justice carried its own weight. Bumpy visited the dead man's family quietly, without entourage or announcement. He sat in their living room, hat in his hands, listening more than he spoke. No excuses, no justifications, just accountability. When he left, nothing was fixed. Grief didn't vanish. But dignity remained intact. And in Harlem, that counted for something. Back on the street where it had all begun, the stain on the pavement had faded, scrubbed away by time and rain. But the memory lingered, in the way people spoke, in the way they watched authority now, in the way Bumpy himself moved a little slower, a little heavier. One trigger pull had exposed a fault line. The response had sealed it. Years later, men would argue about that week the way old soldiers argue about battles. Some would say that was the moment Bumpy Johnson proved he wasn't just another Harlem boss. Others would say it was the day he outgrew the game entirely. But everyone, Police, politicians, gangsters, and civilians alike agreed on one thing. After that day, Harlem moved differently. The story traveled quietly at first. Passed between barbershops and card tables, refined with each retelling but never distorted beyond recognition. A shooting that could have ignited a war. A police captain who thought pressure would force surrender. A legend who chose restraint over retaliation and bent the city without breaking it. That kind of power didn't announce itself. It endured. Bumpy Johnson's reputation changed shape after that. Not bigger, sharper. Where once his name had inspired fear mixed with admiration, now it carried something rarer. Trust. People believed that if something went wrong in Harlem, it would be handled. Not hidden, not ignored. Handled. That trust insulated the neighborhood in ways outsiders never understood. When other boroughs burned with unpredictable violence, Harlem remained tense but stable. Numbers ran, music played, churches filled. The streets knew their boundaries because someone enforced them with consistency instead of impulse. Law enforcement learned as well. No more grandstanding raids without cause. No more captains trying to build careers by provoking confrontations they couldn't control. The lesson was subtle but lasting. Harlem wasn't ungoverned. It was governed differently, by someone who lived there. For Bumpy, the moment lingered privately. He never spoke about it unless pressed, and even then, only briefly. He understood the danger of mythologizing restraint. People needed to believe strength still existed behind it, but those closest to him noticed the shift. He delegated more, listened longer, intervened earlier, before fear had time to harden into violence. He understood now, more than ever, how thin the line was between order and chaos, and how quickly it could be crossed by one careless decision, one trigger pull. That was all it took. And yet, what followed defined him far more than the shot itself. When Bumpy Johnson eventually walked the streets in later years, older, heavier, carrying both respect and consequence in his stride, people didn't step aside out of fear. They nodded. That nod carried meaning. It meant we're safe today. It meant the rules still hold. It meant someone's watching who understands us. That was his legacy. Not domination, but guardianship. Harlem never belonged to him. He belonged to Harlem. And on his darkest day, when authority pressed and chaos beckoned, he proved something rare in the world he occupied. True power didn't need blood to prove itself. It needed judgment. That day was never about a gun. It was about restraint in a world addicted to reaction. It was about discipline in a city that expected men like Bumpy Johnson to answer every challenge with blood. And it was about dignity, quiet, unyielding dignity, when authority mistook pressure for power. One trigger pull threatened to unravel everything he had built, not because it took a life, but because it tested the very idea that order could exist without cruelty. Harlem had seen plenty of men rule through fear. They came loud, they burned fast, and they vanished just as quickly. Bumpy Johnson endured because he understood something most never learned. Respect earned through justice lasts longer than fear enforced through violence. When the police pushed, he didn't panic. When his own people stumbled, he didn't abandon the code. When chaos invited him to become what the world expected, he refused. And in that refusal, he reminded the city who he truly was. This wasn't the story of a gangster escaping consequences. It was the story of a man absorbing them, so his community didn't have to. Harlem didn't remember him for the gun that fired. They remembered him for the line he wouldn't cross. Because sometimes, the most legendary moments aren't marked by bodies in the street or headlines screaming for attention. Sometimes, they're marked by something far rarer. A city standing steady, a balance restored, and a legend proving, on his darkest day, that power without principle was never power at all. That is why his name still carries weight. That is why his story still matters. And that is why, long after the echoes fade, Harlem remembers exactly who stood between chaos and the streets it loved.